G'day everybody, we have Mark Pesce here, and he will be speaking at the Singularity Summit Australia 2012 on August 18th and 19th. Mark Pesce is an inventor, writer, entrepreneur, educator and broadcaster. In 1994, Pesce co-invented virtual reality modeling language file format, which is a 3D interface to the world of wide web. Pesce has written 5 books including VRML Browsing and Cyberspace and The Playful World, How Technology is Transforming our Imagination, which use toys such as Furby and PlayStation to explore our interactive future. As an educator, Pesce founded graduate programs in interactive media at both University of Southern California's world-famous Cinema School and the Australian Film, Radio and Television School. Pesce currently holds an appointment as Honorary Associate in the University of Sydney's Digital Cultures Program. So, Mark, would you like to elaborate more on who you are and what you do?
Gosh, I think what I've always done is I've probably always just followed the things that really interested in me, and that was one reason why I developed VRML. I'd done a bunch of work in virtual reality, and the VR industry was starting to die on the vine just as the web was taking off, and I decided that I'd take the work that I'd done in VR and bring it to the web, and it caught the attention of Tim Berners-Lee, and one thing led to another, and all of a sudden I was running a standards body, creating a platform for 3D on the web long before most computers and most connections were capable of actually supporting it. This has, I think, been my fate in life, is to always be somewhere around 5 years, sometimes 10 years ahead of the curve. We're only starting to get to 3D on the web now with WebGL, and that's about 15 years after VRML had its day. So it's an interesting thing. But the beauty of that, of course, is that it led me into writing and teaching, both of which I love and both of which have become constant passions in the years since then. So I've been able to teach a lot. I've been able to write a bunch of books, including the one that I'm working on right now, The Next Billion Seconds. And I've been able to run around and share my ideas and spread my memes as widely as possible.
Excellent. Some of those memes will be spread at the Singularity Summit. I'm looking forward to hearing those. So, you have the book coming out Next Billion Seconds. Now, it's interesting. I thought that the Next Billion Seconds ends, like if we start from today, somewhere in 2043, if I'm correct. All right, that's
More or
close to.
less.
That's very close to Kurzweil's 2045 prediction of his version of the Singularity. Would you like to introduce the book and explain what it's on about?
There are really 2 billion-second periods. There's the one that we're in the middle of now that goes from 1995, when about 1% of the planet was connected, to 2026, at which point being human and being connected will be seen as being synonymous. So that's one period of time, and that's really the period of time that I'm going to talk about at the Singularity Summit, the mid-singular period, because we're in the middle of that transition. The second period of time, which is the next billion seconds, is us coming to grips with what it means to be in what is literally, practically a hive mind. Doesn't look anything like we thought it was, because we're not eusocial in the same way ants or bees are. Humans are uniquely eusocial. And right now we've gotten all of us together into this amazing eusociality. We used to be eusocial around Dunbar's number, 150 people. People have probably heard of that's the tribal size that we had all through history. Well, now we're eusocial among 5 billion people. And that creates a whole interesting class of possibilities and another whole interesting class of problems.
Excellent. So, mid-singular meaning where we are right now. So, in a sense, your version of the singularity is spanning across a large amount of time.
So I have a story here, and I probably will tell this on stage at the Singularity Summit, but in the 1990s, I was living in Los Angeles, and I was working as a writer some of the time while I was teaching, but I was also working on screenplays, because here in Hollywood, everyone's working on a screenplay. And I was lucky enough to be working on the screenplay for Vernor Vinge's True Names, which is
Excellent.
one of the very first transhuman novels.
Yes.
And so I got to meet Werner as we were working on it. And during this first conversation over dinner, he's sort of assessing me, and all of a sudden the conversation draws to a stop, and he just stares at me and says, "You're a gradualist!" And I pretty much figured that I was guilty of this charge. I guess my thoughts around the singularity have always been that it's process over event. But I also do think that in the hindsight of history, a billion seconds is the blink of an eye.
Yes, it
So
is.
I don't really worry
In
about being
geological
called a
timescales.
gradualist because if I'm describing a process that's a billion seconds long, it seems long while you're in it. But the advent of language probably took a few billion seconds too, and yet relatively, that's an eye blink in human history.
Absolutely. So you're a futurist, in a sense. So what does it mean to you to be a futurist?
What it means is that I look at the present because the seeds of the future are in the present. And so I look around for actually what's going on and try as hard as I can to understand what that means for the world that those seeds are growing into. It's something that happened almost by accident. It started off as a tagline that the ABC was using for me with respect to my panelist spot on the New Inventors for years and years. I didn't come into them as a futurist. I came into them as this guy who knew a lot about media and was teaching and had done all this technology development, none of which fit on a super title very much on the screen. So they're like, okay, we're going to call you a futurist. And it turns out that if enough people call you a futurist, eventually that's what you become.
Interesting. So, do you think futurism is a workable profession?
Yes, I definitely do. I mean, I don't think it's for everybody because you have to really enjoy doing a huge amount of reading and research, and you also have to have a particularly kind of, I guess, observant nature. So some things will be really obvious to me that aren't obvious to other people. You know, watching someone wrestle with a mobile phone while they have a baby carriage in the other hand, and I'll go, wait a second, what's going on there? Or seeing a bunch of people sitting at a bus station staring down into their mobile phones and wait, what's going on there? The first time that I ever saw someone walking around in public wearing headphones because they had a Walkman, which was 1980 in Boston. I was living in Boston at the time. My immediate response was extremely visceral, and it was, my God, how rude, because they'd segregated themselves from the common oral space and put themselves into a private sonic space. And this became the harbinger for all of the personal media that we've seen today. And that moment was resonant. It stuck with me and it sort of became a foundation. And so I just know that I have a mind that works this way, which probably means that I'm well suited to being a futurist. And thank goodness that's what I'm doing.
It's interesting. There's a lot of methodologies that people intuitively pick up about trying to predict the future. So,
Mm.
what methodologies do you employ to make more useful predictions about the future than general intuition, rule of thumb, and the common sense that people often
I
use?
would say that I am a practitioner of the Gibsonian school of futurology. There are two maxims. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? That's one of them. The second axiom is the street finds its own use for things, uses its makers never intended. And so all you really have to do is put both of those principles into play and be observant in the present, and that means being observant, so I guess far out of what's going on in front of you. The mobile revolution has mostly happened in the developing world. I mean, we've got them here and they're great and they're wonderful, but the transformation has mostly taken place in the developing world. We're about to catch up to that. We're not even ready for that. We can't even see it coming. But this seismic shift has already happened in the developing world, well out of our view, because the future is not evenly distributed, and sometimes it happens where you least expect it.
Interesting. There seems to well, with another multiple billion of people rising through university and doing all their study and stuff. It's adding a lot of like mindscape or intelligence to solving problems that we're facing now. It's interesting. So, in a consumer society, the pedigree of prediction is selected for short-term, at least
Mm.
in my opinion, and the decisions, i.e., decisions about marketing and products and how consumers can will need them near term. So, what are the similarities and differences between a futurist role in forecasting 2 or 3 year time horizons, for instance, for mainstream businesses, or
Right.
B, forecasting a 10 to 25 year effects of technology on society?
I tend to stay away from the 20 year because I basically think that anyone who says in 20 years' time is basically waving their hands around. I've been guilty of this, but I try to be guilty of this as little as possible. I try to confine myself to the 3 to 5 and maybe the 5 to 10 year time. I think in part because things are changing so rapidly now that when you actually start to go out beyond that edge, there are too many variables in play. So the world of 2012 is very different than the world of 2009. Already very, very different. And we kind of don't think about it. We don't reflect on it because we're inside of it. And so the statements I made, for example, 7 years ago, I was talking to a bunch of television executives, explaining to them what was going to happen to television broadcasting over the next little while because of BitTorrent, because of what I call hyperdistribution, which is everyone sharing with everyone else. And they didn't believe me. And now they've all had to change their business models to accommodate it. So I can give them a 5 year projection, but my 5 year projections are often so outside their expectation that they aren't prepared to accept them. And I even gave them business models. I said, this is going to happen, and here's some business models that will allow you to work with it. So even when you try to accommodate the business frame in a particular time in a particular place, you only accommodate it to the degree that they're willing to change. And that's going to be true for any person in any situation. Businesses, however, are guided by economic reality. So they have to adapt to the current economic situation or they simply cease to exist. So in that sense, they have no choice in the matter. People can go on blithely ignoring the truth for most of their lives if they want. Businesses cannot. So you have to give the business an unvarnished truth, but that doesn't mean that a business is going to be able to accept it. So you can give people a 3 year prediction and a 5 year prediction. And right now, 3 year and 5 year predictions are so wild that most of the time when you give them, businesses will simply refuse to accept them.
Have you got some examples of those wild predictions?
So I wrote a piece that was published a few weeks ago about why Facebook is worth $1 trillion. And I know everyone's like, oh, the IPO is too much money. No, that's bull. Facebook is 900 million people and about 30 billion connections in a social graph, if you assume each social graph has around 35 connections. When someone figures out that actually presents a platform for banking and for social banking, which is not really about lending your friends money, but about collaborating with them to save, to go on holiday, or to fund a project, or to buy something, whatever it might be. And they realize they have 900 million potential depositors there. They're going to have the largest bank on the planet, and that's going to happen nearly overnight. And then all I have to do is add another profile page that allows them to offer up, well, here are the things that I want to sell, or here are the things that I want to buy, and all of a sudden they've put eBay out of business as well. And I went through and explained these models to people, and I could just sort of hear the heads exploding as I went through all of them, because although this is all right in front of us, this is something that Facebook could do basically inside of an afternoon. They have to buy a bank, that's the one thing, but they get cash for that, and banks are cheap right now. These are the kinds of things that are actually staring us in the face, but they're so outside of our conception of what's possible that they're not happening. It's not that they're not possible, they're easy. And this is the world that we're living in now, is that there's so much around here that's actually easy to make happen, but it's outside of our thinking. And so what's happening now in this billion seconds is our thinking is catching up with our capability.
Interesting. So, are there any ideas that you've held close to your heart about the future which have been overturned by subsequent research?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that for a long time, so I got into virtual reality in 1990, and I basically worked in the field for about a decade, very, very heavily. And I really did think that by now everyone would be wearing full head-mounted displays and this, that, and the other thing, and it would sort of, all be over. But then I helped Sega design the Virtua VR, which was going to be their head-mounted display that was going to plug into what they call the Mega system, or the Master System in Australia, and what was called the Genesis in America. And we went through the entire development cycle, and we sent it out for product testing, and this is when we found out that head-mounted displays are actually really, really bad for you. They're bad for your neck, but they're also bad for your visual system. And so it turns out that this future that we had all thought we would be living in didn't happen at all. But that's because we'd focused on the wrong things. Virtual reality is not actually about head-mounted display or about a data glove. It's about having rich, interactive 3D virtual worlds. And those exist in, I don't know, probably 300 million living rooms around the world because they all have PlayStations and Xboxes and Nintendos. And so VR won, but it won in a completely different way than we had thought.
Do you think people are going to have problems with using Google goggles, or Google
Oh,
Glass,
yes.
sorry?
Yes, I think that the biggest Google Glass to me is hysterical. I know that a lot of people want it really, really badly. And I read a beautiful essay yesterday which said, listen, Google Glass is prelude to schizophrenia. Now, I don't necessarily go that far, but I do think that we have a lot of learning to do around the presentation of information in an integrated visual field in a way that is not fundamentally distracting. Now, mind you, we are all walking around with our earbuds in, listening to stuff and staring at our mobiles as we're walking across intersections. So distraction is not necessarily our biggest problem, but we don't necessarily want to amplify it either.
Hmm. Okay. So, there's a lot of discussion around policy making about the future, but what do you think is missing from the discussions about, about the future that the policymakers are having in boardrooms?
I think that, and this is a big focus of my book and my work right now, I think that policymakers assume that they will remain in control and that the things that they're doing now will produce the results that they've always produced. And I don't think that there's evidence to support that. So I think most assumptions around planning at the policy level are fundamentally flawed. They don't take into account the fact that human capabilities have increased so dramatically and so rapidly. Now, planning's not a bad thing. Goodness knows. But I think that we're going to have to revise planning to be able to understand what's now possible and the fact that we will be harnessing that. And that if policymakers don't harness it, it doesn't matter because folks are going to do it for themselves. For example, food safety is a very big issue in China. You know, they had the melamine poisoning scandal. They've had pork flavored beef that was sold as beef. I mean, you know, everything. There's something every day because there's a lot of corruption in China. There's a lot of bribery. And so there's a lot of stuff being sold to the public that just probably shouldn't be. And the Chinese government is diffuse enough, but also complicit enough in this process to prevent the dissemination of accurate information around this. And so what's happened is that people have been writing their own apps which allow people to track the various things as they're going on, websites that allow them to track it. So your average Chinese person who now carries a device of some sort, may very well be a smartphone, but a billion Chinese now have access to the internet. I think 700 million actually. But either way, there's sufficient penetration of the population that that information can now be brought to hand. And because that process is being crowdsourced, the Chinese government isn't really doing anything about it. They're doing, and so it's filling a gap that's being left by a failure in state power. And that's the world that we're living in. That's the thing that policy planners have to think about, is the fact that people will fill up gaps in the power, and they will also rise up to stop abuses of power.
Okay. So it seems like Facebook's going to have a massive influence, according to your prediction. But will people be worried that it's got too much power and
Oh, no.
monopolizing too much?
I resigned from Facebook 2 years ago. I quitted Facebook aside 2 years ago because I was not happy with the centralization of the social graph, and that actually spurred me on to create right now what is just a design, but what will over the next 5 years turn into a bunch of open source software, something called Plexus, which is designed to be a decentralized, secure social network. And that's going to be a PhD that I'm starting in computer science in the beginning of next year. And the goal there is to provide the tools for people to be able to have their own social networks, because social networks are incredibly powerful capability amplifiers. But in order for them to be safe to use, they have to be secure. And we've already seen a couple of boo-boos with Facebook. Well, as Facebook gathers strength, And it's just going to gather strength because the network's going to figure out how to use itself. Facebook, Zuckerberg doesn't have to really make any executive decisions around this. It's just going to happen because the network is activating itself. That there are going to be more and more of these boo-boo moments, and more unfortunate things are going to happen because of the fundamental architectural considerations in Facebook. Now, this is a thing in computer science. We've gone back between centralized and decentralized systems like clockwork over the last 50 years. Well, right now, things are centralized. There's a lot of cloud, this and that going on. Well, that'll swing back because there will be strong reasons to swing back.
All right. So I have another question, which is about long-term predictions, and you can answer this any way you like. So you can say, well, I don't know, or you can say, well, here's just a prediction, but I'll give it a low confidence weightage or something. But putting a crystal ball on,
Right.
what kind of world do you see in 2043?
Oh, this is, I mean, in other words, what kind of world do I see in a billion seconds? And I don't
Yes.
want to give too much of the talk away,
Okay.
that's the
Yeah.
thing. But what I see are um, both individuals who can bring the power of 5 billion minds to bear on everything they do, but not just individuals, groups who can bring the power of 5 billion minds to bear on any problem or on any activity or against any other individual or group. There's a lovely phrase from Hobbes, omnium bellum contra omnes, the war of all against all. It was a phrase from Leviathan. And the world we're going into looks something like that, but at a very different level, because it's a hive mind, and so it's coherent, but it's also constantly conflicting. And so it is the true competition and cooperation methodologies working together and working against each other, and in a strongly selected environment. So we're going to see the very rapid evolution of new cognitive styles, new linguistic styles, new communication styles that will be battle tested because people will be using them to make their way in the world.
Sounds interesting, but a little bit scary.
The future should be scary. If it's not the future.
So, assuming there's going to be no global catastrophes that halts progress, well, first of all, I should ask the question: do you believe that human-level machine intelligence, not necessarily exactly the same type of intelligence, but let's say level of intelligence, is possible?
I'm going to reserve the answer to that to my talk because I'm going to address that directly in my talk. All right?
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
And I don't want to give too much away.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Well, that's most of my questions, I believe. Is there any other discussion points that is there anything that you've been thinking about recently which has been dominating your attention?
I mean, I really have been looking a lot at how business models are starting to change very radically and very rapidly. And in fact, that's going to be there's a few chapters left of the main body of the next billion seconds, and then I get to spend probably 30 chapters writing about business. And people think, well, is that interesting? Actually, it's fascinating because, in some sense, business is it's a social contract, it's a social field, and it's also an economic, mathematical one. And so there are actually all sorts of interesting forces that are in play now because the social contract is so different. And so that's actually been consuming me, and I spend a lot of time talking to little startups that are doing very interesting little weird things. There's a startup in Sydney called Airtasker. Airtasker makes a smartphone app, and when you have the smartphone app, you can say, look, I want someone to go pick up my dry cleaning, and I'll pay him $20 for it. And it goes out to everyone else who has the app, and there's a kid in uni who has some time, 20 minutes in the afternoon they'll take to do it, they'll accept the job, and it'll all happen. And so what Airtasker has done just with smartphone apps is created this little short-term market in labor and in demand for labor and aggregated all of it. And the further we get into the future, the more that everything we do starts to look like these little gigs or these little tasks, unless it looks like long-term jobs. And it's funny because you go and look at a doctor and a lawyer, that's actually what their days are. They do little term tasks. They may work for a big firm which bills them out, but they're working with a patient for 15 minutes or they're working with a client for an hour. So they're already actually working that way. And in fact, the rest of us, with exceptions, are going to work that way, in part because automation is going to make it possible. So we'll check in on the machines and then we'll go off and do something else. And so we actually have all of these very different styles of how we're going to be interacting around production, around economics. And I find that very, very interesting now.
Okay. Well, do you think Australia has got a different attitude towards radical futurist topics that we've been discussing compared to, say, California?
Well, California is sui generis, all right? I mean, California is where all the freaks go because they're like that. I mean, that's when I was 28, I moved to California because I was like that. And I never regretted the decision, but, you get your fill, it's time to move on. And besides, everyone's very well connected now. We're not really more than a Skype call away from California at any point in time. I mean, the proof of that is how many people saw the Google Glass demonstration yesterday. Either you were watching it live, which some of my friends were, or I watched the YouTube video a couple of hours later, because that's how the world is now. So it's much more around the fact that the radical futurists are now all hanging out and talking to each other whether they're in California or not. Now, it's nice to be embodied, which is something I think the radical futurists need to remember. I mean, why are we having a Singularity Summit in Australia? Because it's nice to be embodied and hang out with other people and talk about these ideas when you're embodied. But there is a global community of people who are all talking about these ideas now and are all sharing and are all learning about how to make these ideas better.
Excellent. Are you aware of Jameis Cassio?
No.
Oh, okay, right. He had a very interesting talk that was videoed. I saw it yonks ago. It was based on the idea of little brothers and sisters instead of a big brother running around,
Right.
life casting, and therefore there being many sort of viewpoints on reality at any given time.
Yes.
And through social networks they could share these
Yes.
and rewind, go back in time. You've probably seen one of the episodes in Black Mirror.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that sort of goes through this, mind recording. You can actually rewind
Yeah.
in time and share these sorts of recordings, sort of
Yeah.
similar to that, right? He called it a participatory panopticon.
Yes.
And so, yeah, the idea was that...
The other word is surveillance.
Yes, surveillance, yes,
Yeah.
that's right, yeah. Also a French word, the opposite of surveillance, not the opposite, but yeah, from the bottom up rather than
The
top down.
inverse. Right.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is the inverse.
And so one of the things that he said it would be very hard to lie in certain circumstances
Oh, yes.
because people would be able to go back, rewind. You wouldn't even be able to doctor certain footage because there'd be so many different perspectives.
If you're a politician, you can no longer lie. Right? I mean, you can dissemble, you can spin, but you can no longer lie. And so this is, and the politicians got there first because they simply have the most panoptic capacity gathered around them. Well, where they go, we are all following. This is what I'm talking about the future being unevenly distributed. The politicians inhabit a certain type of future there. And really anyone who's in the public gaze inhabits that kind of future. Well, you know what Andy Warhol said about the future? Everyone was going to be famous for 15 minutes. And once you're famous, you can't get away with lies.
That's interesting, yeah. So yeah, I kind of, in a way, I look forward to that. I mean, it seems as though it's going to be a bit of a tax on people who value privacy a lot. How are we going to maintain privacy in the future?
I think there's going to be a thriving industry in privacy. That's the interesting thing. I think the same way that there's a thriving industry in sort of security and software defense today, I think that one of the growth industries of the next billion seconds is going to be privacy. And privacy is going to be something that rich people will have because they will be able to pay for it. Poor people will not have privacy because it's just not one of the things that you get if you're poor. You can't afford it. But the richer you are, the greater the degree of privacy you'll have. So, and of course, the richer you are, the more you're going to need privacy because there are going to be more people trying to have a look in. So it's going to become, there's a sort of, I guess you could almost call it Schwarzschild radius between the amount of money you have and the amount of privacy you can actually purchase. Because if you're Carlos Slim or a Bill Gates, you're going to attract attention because there's just too much money there. If you're a Gina Reinhardt, same thing. If you're someone who's maybe only worth $100 million, you probably will be able to get away with being private.
Only $100 million. I'd be glad to have just only $100 million. So the plenty of people I know. Yeah. So yeah. Do you think a lot of people will just like disband and abandon technology in the world where they are completely exposed if they don't have enough money to like?
It won't, well, but I mean, it's not possible to abandon technology because you have to say, well, which technologies are going to abandon? You're going to abandon everything all the way back to language. It's
Yes, yeah,
yes. You can be quite Amish about it and say, well, okay, I'm only going to take these technologies in because these technologies will be edifying to my soul. I think the Amish point of view is actually quite well considered in that respect. And I think that that's actually not a bad idea because there's so much technology around that we actually do, and this is an individual thing. It's also a cultural thing, but there's an individual thing around what technologies do you want to incorporate, and that's probably that actually might be the essential transhuman question, right? You can do anything. We've seen there's been a lot of stuff in the media about the bodybuilders in Australia going off to Thailand because they can get steroids there over the counter, without any trouble. Flights are cheap to Thailand, and they'll go over there and they'll do a cycle of steroids, and they'll come home again. And of course, it's just not particularly good for them. And I look at these people, and I look at them, and I see that these are actually these folks. We don't think of them as such, but they're transhumanists. They're transforming their body. They're using technology to transform themselves and transform their body. And we're gonna get better at that. We're gonna be able to give them, but it's a matter of the question of the decision, because every technology, and this is McLuhan, chapter and verse, and McLuhan's a fundamental influence on me. Every technology is an amputation. Every technology gives you something, but it takes something away. And so you have to be really clear on what that trade-off is. Mobile phones are great, but no one is alone anymore. Right? There's your trade-off.
That's true. I'm just wondering about social systems. Do you think in a very highly connected world, a highly bandwidth connected world, is it possible to have many social systems? And what will be the dominant ones, do you think, in the future?
It will be possible because I think social systems are going to be attention-driven. Right? We can't attend to everything. I mean, there will probably be, as there is now, we have some level of attention to the overall social system that we're in, and then it's the circles of family and friends and all of those social systems. And we have that innate capacity to manage those relationships. That's the 150. We will have, and this is part of what I will talk about in the talk, is we will have a lot of technological support to help scaffold us into participating in a number of other systems. We don't really know anything about the boundaries around that, how many we will be able to support. Even with Facebook, the number of connections that people seem to max out at is around 350. It just seems to be sort of a natural. No one knows if that's a natural limit or if that's an interface limit, or all of this is I think very much in development right now, but we can see where it's trending. So I think the question you're asking is a good one, but I don't think that it admits to an immediate answer, because I think that the answer is in process.
Yes, good one. So, that's interesting. Well, I hope everybody can make it to the Singularity Summit and see you in person. It'll be awesome, with lots of questions. It'll be awesome. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a good time. And it's part of National Science Week too, which is good. Are you doing anything interstate for National Science Week? Is there any activity?
So no, not that I know of. August tends to be a nice, quiet month for me, and so I'm keeping everything down to a low boil, because then things will get busy after that.
Okay. All right, no worries. Well, have you got any other concluding remarks you'd like to put in?
If everyone wants to drop by nextbillionseconds.com, the chapters of the book are being published on there as they're being written. So if you want to sort of see where I'm going, it won't be the same as the talk. I can promise you that. I'm going places in the talk that the book has not gone. then come by and read some of it and see if you like it.
Awesome. Thanks so much. It's been a great interview, Mark. I'll stop it here.